Live from the Cove, this is Derailed Trains of Thought.
Tim, with a name like the Cove, I thought it would be a little more exciting than some apartment buildings.
Yeah, some apartment building. The podcast has just been taking us to some very normal locations for a change.
Yeah, I mean, that guy over there is a little weird. He's exercising just that one bicep.
Yeah,
I don't know. That's
the great thing about an apartment complex. You get some. Sometimes you get some really eccentric people, and we've got some people who collect cereal. It looks like some.
Yeah, it's kind of weird.
Some guy doing crosswords. At least we're hanging out by the pool here.
Yeah,
it's actually pretty comfy.
It's a lot nicer here than it is back in Indiana.
Yeah, it's a little bit warmer for some reason. But anyway, welcome folks to Derailed Trains of Thought. This is Timothy Deal.
This is Nick Hayden.
This is your premier podcast on all forms of storytelling.
For the creator and the absorber. Do you absorb stories?
Sure.
Through your eyeballs.
the creator and the consumer.
Yes, that would be a better way to say it.
We are here in actually not a bad day to hang out at the apartment complex pool.
No. Sounds like we're in America at least. They speak English.
That's always
unless our podcast translator is
helping out, which it does sometimes, and it gets confusing if we get out of the podcast range.
Yeah.
So that's one reason why we try to stay in the little podcast bubble.
Yeah.
I like how the longer we've been doing this, the more we have our understanding of how the podcast works.
Well, we're learning. The podcast slowly reveals itself to us.
That's true. That is
maybe in the future someday we'll know all its secrets.
All its secrets. Speaking of secrets, how are you doing, Nick?
You can't know. You don't have that privilege.
Oh, okay.
I'm doing well. And you, Tim?
I'm doing just fine. So you survived the Apple Festival?
The Apple Festival, yes, in Indiana. The premier festival of Kenville, Indiana.
Well, in Kenville, Indiana, yes, that is true.
Yeah. It beats even the Bluegrass Festival.
I didn't even know there was a Bluegrass Festival.
It's not the Apple Festival. That's why you don't know it.
Apparently not. Apparently not. It was one of the rainier Apple Festivals you've had in a while.
I was very wet at the end of Saturday, like completely soaked.
Oh man,
it was fun. I've never ended that wet at the end of Apple Festival. But Sunday was really nice. I mean, by nice I mean cold, not cold, but cool and
fall-like weather.
It could have been a little cooler, but it was a good day Sunday.
Yes, yeah, I was there Sunday, and it felt
we
pretty
avoided
good.
most of the rain.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of cloudy, a little misty, but honestly, the temperature-wise, it was about perfect. I mean, when you're going to be walking around with lots of campfires and hot vats of oil.
Boiling oil, yeah. Like I sat by most of the time. Not sat by, stood by, cooking fritters.
Yeah.
Lots of fritters.
You wanted a little cool out.
A little, yeah. I mean, everyone else I think was good, but yeah, if you're standing next to the 290-degree bubbling oil, yeah.
Makes sense. All right. Well, I think we should get down to business here.
More stories, less apples.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess is that our new theme?
Yes, that's our new T-shirt. Everyone, more story, less apple.
Speaking of apples and stories, let's go to story school. You like that smooth transition?
That was
there?
a wonderful transition. Yes.
Anywho, this is one of those times where you kind of came up with the topic here for Story School, Nick. So kind of set us up.
So here's the long winding intro. Is that I read this article on grammar, and it was talking about how grammar is there'll be rules like, hey, you don't use double negatives or whatever, but it's only a rule as long as people talk like that. And eventually, when the people start talking different, the rules change. So it's just talking about, you got these grammar Nazis, like, it's always this way. Well, eventually, it's not that way anymore. Like, you can't say ain't. Eventually, people are all saying ain't, and so it becomes
It's in the dictionary now.
You're like, you don't end with a preposition. Enough people talk like that, you do.
Yeah.
I mean...
Basically, that's one of those rules that definitely seems to be fading out.
So there's, so what the point of the article was that grammar is a convention, and trying to pretend that this moment will always be how true English is false.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen by history that English has changed spelling and those kind of rules a lot.
And And so it was that made me think of story conventions that we say, here's what a good story looks like. You got your 3 acts for the movies, or you got the rising, and some of this stuff is, and I think we'll have a discussion on what will always be in a story, and then what's culturally, chronologically, just what we say is a story to make a good story. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking partly because I had read I read this Icelandic saga, and like the tension and the climax just was very blah from my point of view, but it's a classic Icelandic saga. So obviously it was doing something in its convention that doesn't seem like it works
from
for
a modern perspective.
Modern perspective. I read some of these Chinese, were they Chinese or Japanese? I forget now. Short stories, really short, like little bite-sized sort of things. And some of them were like, and things happened, the end. And you're like, but there's no tension, but it's a snapshot of other culture stories. And it just made me think, what are our conventions and what do other stories, how might things change, or how were things?
Well, here's a question for you. So mainly about these cultural stories you're talking about. Were they meant to be sort of like Aesop's fables, do you think? That they were just, where tension is not really the point. It's more about imparting a moral sort of thing?
The Chinese little short things were not, they did not have morals. They were just, they were more almost what we would call flash fiction now, in the sense they were almost for the atmosphere, for the unique setting, for the weird happenings.
Okay.
Like almost like ghost story-ish.
Okay.
The Icelandic saga, I think, is just like the Icelandic version of the Odyssey. Mm. But the Odyssey feels much more Western because we got all ideas from the Greeks.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, fair enough.
So I think those are some of the reasons. And it's been a long time since I took a cross-cultural literature class. We read like Things Fall Apart and the Bingo Palace and some other stuff written by non-white Americans or non-Western writers.
Okay.
The Bingo Palace by an Indian Native American. I don't remember much of that story at all, but give you flavors of some of these other styles. Again, some of them were written in America, so they still had some of that.
Okay.
But they had different perspectives.
Sure.
And not so much convention sometimes.
Okay.
I mean, I think Things Fall Apart had just a different feel, even how the story unwound. That was African.
Okay.
Chinea Achebe, I believe is the guy's author's name. So anyways, like nowadays I think maybe we should just start, what is, modern 2018, assuming you're listening to this in 2018, story convention. What do we expect out of a story?
Well, I think a lot of our understanding from this comes from pop culture, and in some ways larger than written works. And by pop culture, I guess that includes really super popular books like the Harry Potter series.
But we're not talking literary stuff at this point.
Not really. But what are some of the things that people come to expect from your basic pop culture story? I think you expect a strong protagonist that wants something and sets out to get it, or has to overcome odds or things like that. I mean, a lot of it comes from the hero's journey mythos, because people became familiar with that after Star Wars.
Yes. And Star Wars shaped a lot of our storytelling conventions, especially in pop culture.
Mm-hmm. And the hero's journey is typically either the protagonist looks for, somehow there's a call to action, call to adventure that sets off on a quest, on a journey, on a trip to overcome obstacles, and eventually there's a climax and he has to confront someone. And
I feel like we want climaxes now that are big, lots of moving pieces, like the end of the world sort of. Your main character changes everything. Like your main character is the pivot point of all history.
All these, well, depending on how the scope of your story, yeah.
And I think also we just expect stories to be very emotional. And I think that's a convention that is not shared in all cultures, where you have to have this deep emotional connection to your main character.
You should be able to feel what he feels.
Feel what he feels.
Yeah.
And I think when we talk about other cultural conventions, an easy one for a lot of people, at least for me, is the Bible. These are stories. I mean, they're nonfiction, but they're still written as stories, as history, how we're relating things. And like, for instance, the crucifixion, the Gospels. When modern people do the crucifixion, they put a lot of emphasis on pain and the gruesomeness.
Passion of the Christ, obviously.
The Bible just says, and he was crucified.
Nah.
I mean, that's it. I mean, as far as the agony, they don't say any of the feelings they're having is just facts. And some of that's because it's reporting history. But even if we were reporting in modern day, we'd do it in like a, like some sort of journalistic essay, and we'd capture what people were feeling and thinking. And they were much less concerned with individual thought processes. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think you can see that in how we approach history a lot of times too. You go to a historical site and their main focus a lot of time, I mean, they'll tell you what people did there, but they spend a lot of time telling you what someone's everyday life was back in the Civil War period or Revolutionary War period, whichever sort of historical site you're at. It's almost as if for a lot of people to really relate to history, they have to know like the personal details of it, which almost make it sound like it's more important than why did they actually make the choices that they were doing, which I don't know that they would say that, but sometimes just what the common emphasis is on feels sometimes more like the experiential stuff than the actual intellectual reasons for things. I mean, and I wonder if that, goes with our other storytelling too. When stories were more about morality plays, then the focus was less on the experiential factor and more on here's what you learn. Yes.
Or here's the takeaway. I don't think nowadays, the movie's takeaway is not a idea or virtue, it's an emotion.
Yeah. And I do think sometimes that can hinder my enjoyment of it. I mean, obviously, I'm a modern guy. I enjoy the emotional thrill, the rush of an action movie as much as anyone. But I saw Venom recently.
Yeah.
It was not necessarily my choice to see Venom, but I wound up seeing Venom. And it was an entertaining flick. I mean, it wasn't nearly as bad as I was afraid it might be. It wasn't particularly great, though. And for me, I think I didn't have a very strong connection to the characters. I mean, they had some kind of funny moments, but there wasn't any one character I thought, oh man, he's really redeemed himself here, or like this is a great kind of hero to look up to. It's like no, there's just some guys.
Yeah.
is kind of the impression I came away with, and that I think that is something that differentiates an okay story from a great story, and from a modern perspective.
Yeah,
where that we love the Avengers or like Thor or someone because we see them truly yearning to do good, or there's something real that connects with us, and it's not just that this is a cool action thing. Yeah. It's like it feels, even if it's mostly popcorn stuff, it feels there's some other sort of secret sauce in there that resonates with us more strongly, because I think if it has a greater element of truth in it.
I guess another idea, you're just trying to analyze these conventions that we have now. Because, again, you go to stories, some writing class, you're going to say, here's how you write a story, A, B, C. And then I remember, I don't know how true it is, but someone writing that some people in Hollywood thought that Inception was horrible because they spent so much time with exposition and you shouldn't do that in your first act or whatever. And it's like, okay, but it worked. I mean, for me. Yeah. And I think, let's use a musical example. Baroque era music was super complicated. It was all about the playing with the notes. And then classical had these structures. And the enjoyment in classical music depends on you understanding the structures. Then Romantic period came, and the enjoyment of music was on the emotion. And I wonder if movies didn't go through I think some older classic movies are more about the pieces and how they move. And it could be wrong. I don't know enough classical movies, but I think there's probably times in cultures or even in our own culture where the emphasis is more on how things fit together, how things play within the expected norms and outside of it. Poets do this all the time. Oh, we play with the sonnet structure, not the sonnet structure. Or, you write an epic poem, and so you always have to call the muse to help you. And there's just these things you expect, and you play within them, and that's how you're judged, how well you play within the box. Right. As opposed to later, it's, in romantic music and movies nowadays, how well you can make people feel.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I'm not an expert as much as, say, our old co-conspirator Brian would be on classical Hollywood stuff. And I would say that some classical Hollywood movies might play with some of this emotional stuff. I mean, there were definitely some soapy movies from back then.
I mean, there's always going to be... I mean, even the classical music still has emotion to it. You know? Yeah.
And there's been pulp fiction and books for a very long time too.
Yeah.
But I definitely agree that there are definitely advantages to working inside a convention, and there are advantages to kind of blending the conventions of not sticking so true to one. I don't think it's a fair criticism sometimes if people say, well, this story didn't do this thing right. This is what stories are supposed to do. And it's like, well, but if it did that thing, then it wouldn't be that story.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like, I mean, there's advantages and disadvantages. Now, in film school, I remember talking with a professor and him really kind of trying to hammer across, look, while you're learning your craft here, it's very important to learn the rules of the craft. And cinema, for example, definitely has its own rules. And sometimes when students get excited about, well, what if we don't follow the rules? Let's do our own thing.
Yeah.
The problem is then you sometimes get these pretentious student films or art house films that like doesn't treat its audience right. I was just reading a review in World Magazine not too long ago about a documentary about, if I remember right, it was about people that were in the last stages of life sort of thing.
Okay.
But unfortunately, it was just a really terribly made documentary. Like she said, like it started with several minutes of just blackness and like a voiceover. And then like there was a really long shot that was just staring at this one patient. And the reviewer, Megan Basham, said that it started making me angry as a reporter because I wanted to hear these people's stories, but they weren't being told in an audience-friendly manner or in even a very good manner. It was just kind of this pretentious art house thing that just wasn't working. And I've seen student films trying to do the same thing. It's like, no, you have to learn how to work within the rules of your craft before you can understand the proper ways to break those rules. Yeah. And then there are definitely people like Christopher Nolan that can break cinematic rules really, really well.
Well, and we were mentioning beforehand, one of our old favorite movies, not favorite, but Lady in the Water.
One that we were enamored with at the time.
And we haven't seen since, but it broke massive amounts of rules.
Yeah. And there's definitely some audiences and critics who hated it. You and I, we were fascinated by it at the time. And I'd be very curious to go back to it and see if we still dug it or if now we're like,
whatever.
Yeah, I don't know. It'd be an interesting experiment. But yeah, M. Night Shyamalan is one of those guys who would like try really out there stuff. And sometimes it worked and then sometimes it didn't connect with audiences.
And so we'll have these sort of like conventions like pop culture versus literary versus art house. But I think you also then see, over time, just certain things that are accepted, like grammar, accepted. Like silent films have a different convention, not just because they're silent, just because what they thought was important to show.
That's true. The expectations change for what should be. I mean, if you've been watching movies for all your life, you have such a stronger cinematic vocabulary than the people would have been watching, in the 1940s. Not to say that the 1940s movies were bad or not smart. It's a different vocabulary in a lot of ways.
And at the time, they were super popular, the sort of movies everyone wanted to watch because they were meeting the needs of, or they were being what the people wanted. Yeah. Just like language changes, the language of story changes.
Exactly. And it's, again, not to say that they're bad. We don't get to do the, I think C.S. Lewis calls intellectual snobbery.
Chronological snobbery.
Chronological snobbery, thank you. Where we assume that all the modern stuff is better and all the old stuff is bad. Not at all. It's just speaks to different cultures in a lot of ways.
And I think the creators can benefit from reading things from various eras, various spots. Russian novels I think here's an interesting thing. I think generally, and it changes depending, but I think generally Americans still have, again, superheroes and stuff, it changes, 2 or 3 main characters. Mm-hmm. You have maybe cast characters, but like Russian novels, there's like bazillions of characters. And there might be able to be 1 or 2 main ones, but they juggle a lot more characters than most American books do.
Were Russian novels serialized? Like
yes.
Dickens were? Okay. See, I wonder if that makes a big difference.
And that's probably part of it too. Because, Dickens, Les Mis, I guess that time period, tons of characters was the language.
Because I've noticed if you, in an anime series, the longer it goes on, a lot of them, the longer it goes on, the bigger your cast of characters. And you always have your main ones, but they tend to have lots of side characters. They have really interesting stories. But then when you take a step back and you look at the cast photo and you're like, holy cow, this is a lot of people.
I suppose, actually, anime is a good example of convention because that's Japanese culture. We have American, and the two have really melded in many ways. Animes and conventions influence American, and American influence anime.
Oh, yeah. My Hero Academia is one of the hottest animes right now, which I'm kind of on like season 2, and it's hugely influenced by superhero culture.
Okay, yeah.
From America. I mean, there's no bones about it. Like one of the main characters, or one of the main, like the Superman villain, essentially, his move attacks are like named after U.S. states. I mean, it's got some of that ridiculous over the top anime-ness to it.
But like anime and I don't know if it's just I've seen more anime than like traditional Japanese film, but are much more comfortable with open-ended endings, which is something even now most American stuff. A story convention is your beginning, middle, end means you have an end that has everything's answered and wrapped up and happy
with an epilogue, and you know where all the characters are at now.
And Japanese tends to be like, and they just leave it hanging. And then there's some cultures like British or other places where they're perfectly happy with a sad, awful ending. Which American story convention is you end happy.
Yeah. If you're going to be mainstream.
Again, and we're talking mainly because the problem with story convention is like dialects and language. The language thing. Here's the main language that everyone talks, and then you got your
accents
and dialects.
Variations. And it all kind of blends together, especially in such a story bonanza society that we live in now. Story bonanza. That's not the word I was looking for, but like we're inundated with story now, and so there's definitely flavors of all types these days.
It's all over the place. So for story about convention, you really have to take the bird's eye view.
Mm-hmm. Even with that, sometimes people will, and this is the downside of academics, I think, in some ways, when people get a little too beholden into how does this story fit into such and such convention. One podcast I listen to periodically, I get kind of tired of them trying to connect every story they talk about to the hero's journey. Yeah. Which we just mentioned hero's journey earlier, and it is a very useful thing. And there are some stories that are very obviously indebted to it. But when you try to like line up every story with like, okay, well, and then where was the call to action here? Oh, does this person have agency? And so it's like, I don't care about that. I just want to know. I want to know about this story's identity. I don't really want to know how it fits into these little like formulas.
The problem is, like I said, conventions say the hero's journey is chicken or egg. We it became the hero's journey because a lot of stories used it. Mm-hmm. And because a lot of stories used it, people studied those stories because they liked them and started doing it themselves. But it's not a magic bullet. Famous stories used it, so the other famous stories copied it, but the first story didn't say, oh, I have this hero's journey I'm going to make. People find what works and they hone it. It's interesting. I think one way to think about convention is to take some classic story and see how we would make it now. This happens all the time with, Alice in Wonderland. That story, there is not a plot. I mean, there's a plot, but it is just whatever. But every era that makes it has to fit it into popular culture somehow.
Alice becomes a strong female hero of some sort or other.
Or the Mad Hatter is this has issues with his dad. I don't know. But I mean, and some of that's to update it, but updating basically saying, how do we make it fit, make it palpable to, Peter Pan's like that. It's been retold so many times. Yeah. Same moving parts.
And it's not entirely bad.
It's just, it's an interesting
dynamic
representation of, how are we going to make this story fit into my 3 acts or into my 5 acts or into big budget climax or whatever is the thing.
And I guess I'm okay with that as long as we always have access to the original versions of these things.
Yes.
And I would also encourage people to, okay, so you enjoyed the Disney weird Johnny Depp version of okay, I'm not a huge fan of Alice in Wonderland, but you should at least have some understanding of what the original version was like. And the same with
some great puns, I'm telling you.
I don't know. I just think that'd be good for a lot of adaptations.
Things that have fallen out of stories that used to be. Like the Icelandic one had it. at the beginning, Bible stuff, genealogies, the sense of, but seriously, the sense of place, and Silmarillion has them. I mean, old stories have the sense, I'm sure probably Odyssey has a certain amount of that sort of lineage and royalty. We couldn't care less now, and we chop all that out of all our stories. It's sort of rooting the hero. Now we root our hero in almost an archetype, but you used to root your hero in a family, in a dynasty, in a
spot in history.
That was what partly made a hero. Is because who he was from his ancestry through his, and that's a convention that is still used occasionally, especially in fantasy things, but it's largely gone.
I wonder when people started paying less attention to their ancestry, if it just became because it became too unwieldy, as opposed to we'd have a lot less history. It's a lot easier to keep track of all our ancestors.
I wonder how all American that is.
Oh, that's a good question too.
We just came over and we're all Americans.
Essentially, even I had a grandmother that liked to research genealogy, but it's hard for most people to go much farther back than immigration from Europe kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That tends to be the cutoff date almost.
So, that was just one convention that, I've seen in older stuff. This, again, even Silmarillion, Tolkien borrows it from old story. Silmarillion is a great example of variety of convention. He writes in 3 or 4 different styles. To get the convention of ancient myths and middle myths and modern myths.
Well, Nick, if we were to wrap this up, and I think it'd be good to talk about, we've talked about all these kinds of conventions and old stories and modern stories. So what do you think we could say is the core elements of a story? Is it just the hero's journey, or is there some simpler thing that even some of these weirder versions of stories still have?
Well, I think you can't get away without having a beginning, middle, and end. You have a progression.
Okay. Time is still a factor.
Obviously, we even talked in other podcasts that you can mix the time up, but there's still a progression, begin, middle, end. And
you still have some sort of protagonist, I would assume.
You'd have to have, you can get kind of funky. There's that Ray Bradbury story where the house is just doing its thing. Have you read that one? There Will Come Soft Rains is the name of the story.
Is it like a modern house that's all automated?
It's all automated, and you realize at the end of that, everyone was nuked, but the house is just still going.
Oh, okay. But in that case, the house is a character.
The house is a character. Yeah, exactly. But you can stretch it, but you still need a character. You still need a progression. I still think you need some sort of
struggle.
Some sort of struggle. Otherwise, it's just a scene, a vignette, a poem. You still need a struggle to overcome or not overcome. But outside of that, I think there's, we like the struggle to end in a giant climax. I think some of this other stuff, how much emphasis you put on certain things, whether you got character studies versus it's all about the emotion versus it's all about the giant scene at the end versus it's all about what did we learn, what we learned
to our lives today.
Anyways.
And I think it's important to not judge a story based on your preconceived notions sometimes of what a story could be, but and we've talked about this before back in the how to read a story thing, but I will keep repeating it so people remember.
You can not like it and can still be a good story.
Yes, it may not be what your preferences for a story are, but they may still be interesting choices for making that story that story.
Yeah. And I think, the more, especially as you go into different cultures and times, you'll understand what is trying to be done here, as opposed to what do you think should have been done here from our point of view. But I think, character who wants something and things happen. Again, it might be, this is one of these Chinese stories is this guy, he had an injury, his neck almost fell off, but they sewed it back up. And then one day there was this prank pulled and he laughed so much his head fell off. That was his story.
Okay.
He's just exactly, okay. But, there's an incident, there's a progression, something happened at the end. The focus was completely on kind of the atmosphere on the, something strange is going to happen. And not on, a struggle per se, outside of, I don't want to lose my head. But so you have lots of different things. So that's what I got.
That's all you got.
So I think it's good for the viewer, the consumer, to be aware that just because your favorite story is this way, not everyone's is. And creator, I think you can just learn lots of different stuff from reading outside your wheelhouse.
Oh, sure. And as you're writing your story, I think it's important to be aware of your audience. Like, even if you think you're pretty comfortable with breaking certain conventions, certain rules, I think it's a little unfair to just force your audience to accept it. Like, sometimes you have to take an outsider perspective and be like, would I appreciate this if I didn't understand what was going on here?
This is what you need beta reader to say, here's what I'm feeling, and be like, no, that's why I want you. Or, I want you to be deadly confused for the first 50 pages.
I mean, we were just talking before we started recording about Dark Crystal and about whether or not they should have kept original Dark Crystal. Only the Gelflings, the main characters, spoke English.
Everyone else had their own languages.
Yeah. And then test audiences just got really confused. But in some ways, you didn't really need like the Skeksis to talk English because they would have just...
It's filmed in such a way you could pick it up.
Right. But apparently the Jim Henson Company has never chosen to release a director's cut, or not director, well, I guess co-director's cut. They never got Frank Oz to do a version without it. And I would imagine, I mean, they may just not have the film for it, but it's possible they do. And they just decided, no, this wasn't a good idea for audiences, so we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting choice they had to make there between breaking conventions and keeping the audience happy.
Keeping more popular popular convention.
Yeah. Anyway, let's wrap that up for real now, and we'll move on to soundtrack. Okay, for my soundtrack today, I decided to go with a little jazz, because jazz is a convention, but it also can take many different forms. I mean, improvisation is built into the cake with jazz a lot.
That is the language of jazz.
It is. It's about exploring what you can do with it. But at the same time, jazz is not necessarily just smooth jazz. There's Latin jazz, or in this case, kind of a honky-tonk jazz. Woohoo. And this song kind of starts off jazzy, then it kind of turns into something else. But this remix is called Honky Town. It is from the OC Remix album Super Mario RPG Window to the Stars, which features a lot of music from Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars. But this song also has, I think, a little bit of Robo's theme from Chrono Trigger in it.
Nice.
The remixer is Weisty, I'm not sure how you say his name, with some help from Expert Novice. And I hope you enjoy. we're back.
That was entertaining.
Yes, I thought so. Like I said, sometimes you really have to please your audience.
Exactly.
Next up, we have our take
on Tales.
Now, you may be thinking, you guys just did this last episode. Well, sort of.
Yes, we did movies.
We did summer movies, but it's been a while since we've really sunk our teeth into a book to talk about. And although technically this is going to be Nick's take on Tales, a little more than mine. So what do you have to talk about next?
All right, because I thought combined with our story school, there's these things called Penguin's Little Black Classics. And they're these little tiny, you can't see I'm holding them up, little tiny black books. They're about 50 pages. And there's a collection of 80 of them I asked for my birthday and got. And I was super excited because they were just the range of cultures and time periods and styles. And it's just basically like, hey, and here's a snapshot of literature.
In booklet form.
And I'm like, oh, this is cool. I can just read 50 pages of this and 50 pages of that. And I've read like 7 or 8 of them now. And I thought it'd be fun to just kind of do a rapid fire thing. You can buy them individually if one piques your interest. And since we're talking about story conventions, is kind of have a more, we were kind of talking about different cultures and different styles. I thought this was a good time to kind of sneak in my story school on these.
Story school? You mean your take?
Oh, my take on Tales. Yes. So the first one is my least favorite so far. It's called Mrs. Rosie and the Priest. It's actually Tales from the Decameron, which is this famous Italian classic. It has 100 stories. That's why it's called the Decameron, by Giovanni Boccaccio. I don't know. I butchered the Italian. These are ridiculously bawdy stories.
Ooh.
They're like the raunchy comedies. Seriously, they fit right in with any raunchy comedy movie. Mm-hmm. One of them was kind of funny. The rest of them just like, why am I reading these? It's the first book. I gotta get through it just for completeness sake. They're not explicit, but they're just a lot of innuendo. A lot.
Kind of like the Three Musketeers was.
No, worse than that.
Oh,
but so I don't really recommend that, except maybe just for the sort of
awareness.
Short story style. It's kind of an interesting style, I guess, but not my cup of tea. I remember I took the Decameron. Be like, my grandma had all these classics. This would be fun. 100 stories. This would be exciting. Kind of like Handmaid's Tales, where these people are just sharing 10 stories each. I took it to Brazil with me the first time, thinking it was going to be like a good classic book, and it wasn't. So I stopped.
And your missionary in-laws were like,
first time they met me, yeah.
And you're like, sorry, I don't have anything good to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that. Italian, what years are this? These are like from the 1300s.
Oh, that one was?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So they have
quite old. But it's interesting to come up with 100 of this. Almost all the stories about basically relationships between guys and girls.
It's kind of funny that survived that long, of all things. That's before Gutenberg Press, isn't it?
I don't. Yeah.
That's
interesting. Just apparently it was well written at the time. I don't know.
Okay. Anyway.
Okay. Next, collection of poems by Gerald Manley Hopkins. The title of the collection is As Kingfishers Catch Fire. This was awesome. Okay, this is from the 1800s. He's a priest. He writes a lot of nature poetry, but it's very much grounded in sort of faith and nature reveals God. Very interesting stylings. I guess when he was alive, most people didn't think much of his poetry, but it's good stuff. It's hard to understand. At the end are some journal entries of his, where he's just constantly describing nature. And I'm reading these things I don't even know how you would. I kind of know what you're talking about. He's super visually detailed about clouds and snow, how it lays on the ground. And I'm way over I'm not a visual writer. You can tell that was how he connected with the world.
Okay.
Anyways, very unique poetry. I would recommend that, even if you don't like poetry. Third is the Saga of Gunnlaug Serpent Tongue. This is the Icelandic saga.
I love the name.
Yes. Written in, I guess it was an oral story originally, written down in about 1300, but the action is set in 1000 AD.
Ooh.
This one was weird.
So wait. It was written in 1300, but...
Written down, but the action takes place in 1000.
So it was a historical fiction, basically, when it was
written.
Unless
it was oral tradition before that, so maybe it was just kept from all that time ago.
Okay, I got you.
But you got tribes, you got... it feels very much like it's sort of like a Odyssey, or more like a Beowulf, I guess.
Okay.
But there's nothing supernatural or anything. It's like this guy falls in love and then he goes on this trip. He says, I'll be back soon. And then he hangs out. And he's called the Serpent Tongue because apparently he has these really biting like poem insults. So he like the Serpent Tongue. And the poetry is very strange from our point of view. I mean,
so it's sort of he's sort of an expert at rap battles is what it sounds like.
Kind of, yeah. Anyways, it's very interesting, but it's very old school. I wouldn't read it except for the experience. On Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts by Thomas Dick Quincy. It's like this satire about, as if he's writing to this, I think, like Hell's Club about murder is like a fine art, and here's some of the best examples of it throughout history. And it's very much like, sort of like a modest proposal, screw tape letter sort of thing.
Okay.
From 1700s. That was pretty fun. That was interesting.
Huh. Okay.
Actually, Nietzsche had aphorisms on love and hate, just some of his thoughts on things. I really enjoyed.
Really?
Like, Nietzsche had a lot of this is the first Nietzsche I read. A lot of truth. Like, I don't agree with his point of view, but he was very perceptive about humanity in lots of ways. But like, it ends at certain places I would push it farther.
Okay. You mean towards redemption?
Like, he sees very much a sinful area of man, but like everything's just about power. Everything's put in terms of power. And
okay.
Like one of the more interesting things he talks about, if someone does something nice to you, you have to do something nice to them. It's like a version of revenge, because otherwise they have power over you if they do something nice, but you don't pay them back.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyways, very perceptive, but like not from a Christian point of view, like a half truth or whatever. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was like reading Proverbs, kind of, but.
So was it
atheistic.
all philosophical then?
It was written almost like a book of Proverbs in many ways, like little just thoughts that were kind of grouped together in
interesting
ideas. Well, almost my favorite so far, and most surprising, is this thing called Traffic by John Ruskin. It's basically two essays, one called Traffic, one called The Roots of Honor. And they're essays or things he wrote, I don't know, 1800s or whatever. Yeah, early 1800s or mid 1800s. One's about like, what kind of architecture should the new exchange be built in? And he basically just like took him to task about only being cared about money. And it's very much social commentary on money and society that I think is still applicable in many ways. And I'd never heard of this guy at all. And I was very happy to read that one.
Where is he from?
And I think it's English.
English? Okay. With the name like Ruskin, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, it's European at least, and I think it's English. London, yeah.
Okay.
And then finally, Wailing Ghosts is a collection of Chinese stories by Pu Songling.
Ghost stories?
Not all ghost stories, but a lot of them, 1600s. Well, you know, the guy with his head that fell off I mentioned. Some monsters just showing up randomly. There's one really pretty good story about like this guy who marries this kind of fairy, and then he finally leaves and he can never go back, and there's all kind of sad at the end. Just one time when like this guy makes a deal with these or like this guy exorcises spirits from this house. I mean, sometimes it's like just things happen and you feel like, okay. But they're all kind of just, it's like supernatural intermingling with real life, sort of little snippets. Flash fictions are all super short. So that was just my rapid fire little black classics. I would actually recommend. They're like just a couple dollars if you want any one of these.
So you don't have to get the big collection in order to read some of them.
And there's a lot more. There's histories coming up that I need to read, and there's like one on Caligula coming up. And
so that was like was seven of them.
Yeah.
How many are in your collection?
Mine are 80. I think they made 120 altogether.
Wow.
In England, you can get each of them for £1.
Okay.
That was the whole thing. I mean, a couple dollars here.
Okay.
By extra shipping, Amazon, and all that stuff.
But that was kind of their selling point in England. That
it's like I guess originally when Penguin started, things were £1. This was like some anniversary.
Okay.
And they made, and it's a cool way to just kind of see a wide range of different styles of not just stories, but just how people communicated throughout history, throughout different places. And when I'm done with all of them, I mean, the communists, some Marx, there's Greek myths, there's Russian short stories, there's poetry from Japan. So yeah, I'll keep you up to date whether you want to or not.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I'm more interested that you're interested in
than reading it yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
They're 50 pages, so something like between books, I'll just read one. Even if it's boring, it's not that long.
Okay.
So, and normally they're interesting enough just for me, they're interesting enough just as an experience, as like, what is this thing?
So it's almost like the Cliff Notes, a collection of Cliff Notes almost.
It's like a survey of world writing.
A world tour of
A
writing.
world tour. It really is. And it's kind of interesting. Maybe there's some stuff that's pretty modern. And some stuff that's, like, I think Modest Proposal's next with me, Jonathan Swift.
Okay.
That and one other thing he wrote, because they try to fill up the 50 pages.
Gotcha.
All right, that's what I got.
Okay.
That's to counteract the superhero movies from last episode.
Yeah, you got really artsy, or
I got real artsy.
or literary, I guess, to be more accurate. Well, I don't have. I guess this could be considered a take on Tales, but it's also, but I'm also kind of tying it into a previously on. Way back, I can't believe it was this far back. Back in episode 16.
Man, we were babies back then.
Yeah, I know. Way back then, we talked about interactive fiction, and we talked a lot about like choose your own adventure books, video games. We touched a little bit on tabletop with like role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder, which I guess is still a pretty big thing. My friend Tim was telling me that podcasts and like video channels of Dungeons and Dragons are just booming in popularity right now. Yeah.
Huh.
I guess because of I guess the latest edition. What are they on now? I think 5th edition.
Okay.
I think is doing very well, and they really tailored it to be very story friendly.
Nice.
It's less combat kind of stuff.
That's more matches modern convention for people now.
Yeah, I think it does. And
more feelings, less mechanics.
that's probably that's true actually. But I mean, it is a really interesting way of having a bunch of improvisational storytelling.
Yeah.
Having a bunch of players together to do that. But I thought it'd be interesting to talk about kind of another realm of tabletop gaming that I don't know if this is how much of a trend this was, but I went to Gen Con back in July of this year. And if you're not familiar, Gen Con is actually the largest board game convention in North America. And it's right in our backyard down in Indianapolis every year. And I got a chance to demo 2 games that kind of have an interactive story element to it. Now, a lot of tabletop games have a story theme, a concept. You know, it's something to kind of hook if it's a resource management, you know, your rival merchants, and if it's a fighting game, each of the fighting characters has some sort of quirk or what have you. But these kinds of demos I want to talk about were quite different. Now, one of them was just straight up choose your own adventure, the board game.
I played from the library the one called something about a house, dangerous house, or
yeah, I think that was probably the same one I did.
Natasha at the library. We played like the first chapter of it,
and it's kind of fun because you got like the cards, and then you'll say if you want to go this direction, go to flip the card, such and such.
And you can get items, and you
collect items. You have got a little psychic meter.
Yeah, so in danger, you roll your it's. I remember, I don't know if we mentioned back in interactive fiction, Lone Wolf books. Do you remember those?
I think you might have mentioned it, but I don't think I ever
But basically, they were books you read like Choose Your Own Adventure, but that you had hit points and stuff, and there's this randomized table in the back you throw your pencil at and tell you what your thing was. You can get them online. They're all for free online now.
Okay.
Project Aeon, I believe. Anyways.
Well,
remind me of that.
Yeah. Oh, well, you probably played about as much of it as I did. We demoed like the first chapter. One thing I came away with about it was like it was kind of neat, but at the same time, it didn't really feel like it needed to be a group thing. Like basically as a group, and we had like 4 people. I guess it'd be different with just you and Natasha.
We just fought over. No, we'd like, let's go this way. Or like, no, don't go to the ape with the violin. That's a bad idea.
Yeah. And in a little larger group, you're basically doing the same thing. People vote on which way you want to go and stuff. But technically you could just play the game all by yourself. And if you're doing that, then you could just go get a book.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't, at some point you have to ask, is this really worth spending $30, $40 for a board game version of this?
Yeah. It was interesting when we tried an interesting thing. But yeah, I'm glad to have rented it. I don't know if I would want to buy it.
Yeah. Yeah. Would that be something that you could see playing with your kids?
I could. We thought about doing that one, but with the psychic stuff, we're like, no, not at this point.
Yeah, I could see that. Well, the other game that was along this vein that I saw which I thought was super interesting, is a game called Holding On: The Troubled Life of Billy Kerr. And in this game, it's a cooperative game.
Okay.
And all the players are people at a hospital staff that are caring for this man who had a heart attack while he was in flight. I don't remember. I want to say Australia to California, but that sounds like a certain show.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's accurate. I don't remember all the details. But anyway, he was on a heart attack. You got rushed to your hospital. And so your job in the game is to basically make his final days as peaceful as possible.
Interesting.
The guy that was setting up the demo said straight up, the goal in this game, you are not going to save him. That is not something that is going to happen. This game is about trying to make his last days as easy as possible and trying to help him maybe remember things, get his family here on time before he goes.
Okay.
That was the goal of the game.
How do you play this game?
Well, it's partly resource management.
Okay.
Because you had to make certain choices about staffing your hospital. Like they'll play out certain cards that say how he's doing that day.
Oh, okay.
And so you have to decide whether you're going to allot extra staff to like work overtime to kind of help him out, or if he doesn't need that much
Now,
attention.
Does someone play him, or do the cards just play him?
The cards just play him.
Okay.
And I don't remember all the mechanics. This was like 3 months ago, but there was also a part of, as you treat him, you start building points of rapport with him.
Okay.
And which in turn also helps him remember things, get details, and maybe open up about trying to get. And from what I understand, on the first playthrough, you won't get his full story. Like you actually start to learn more and more about his life as it goes on. But because it's kind of a time-based thing as he passes away, you won't learn everything on your first playthrough.
Okay, it's kind of like when we played the interactive fiction, some episode where
Yeah.
we had that one move, and we kept learning different. Well, it was lots of different versions of
Right, of the same day, essentially. But yeah, something like that. You couldn't get the complete story unless you played it multiple times. But I thought this was fascinating, and I imagine part of it may have been, I can almost imagine this being developed by someone who used to work at a hospital.
Yeah.
It's like, people need to know what this is like, kind of the whole, because your staff can get worn out if he has to work overtime too much. But
Is it a game you think that would create empathy?
I think so. I mean, it was because you're all working together to, like most co-op games, I don't know, you ever played Pandemic?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you do want to try to save the world. Because that's kind of the goal of the game, and you get into that mindset. And so it's the same sort of thing. I think you do feel for this fictional character that you're trying to save as much as possible.
I guess a sidetrack. It's just interesting how much the cooperative game has gained prominence.
Yeah.
Like growing up, everything was against each other. That was just how you played games.
Well, I guess this may go along with the rise of European styles of board games, because I remember I read an article a while back that kind of put this into perspective, that a lot of American board games always have had this kind of competitive thing because that's American, whereas in Europe, and particularly in Germany, which, as I mentioned, Gen Con is the largest one in North America. Germany has the largest board game convention in the world right now.
Because they make a lot of board games.
Yeah, but their purpose was much more non-combative, because this is something that an industry that really developed after World War II.
Yeah.
And so their whole focus as a country is much less on conflict and now much more on trying to cooperate in peace. So that's why Europe is where you get a lot of these resource building kind of games. And since that is very slowly kind of seeped into American stuff, now I think we have a lot more kind of a blending of these things.
So our board game conventions have been changing.
Yes, exactly. That's why I chose this topic. It's a convention, playing with conventions. Anyway. But what I think is, the other thing I think is really interesting about this game in particular, Holding On, technically this game could have been a computer game. If you were just about telling this story, I should say, you could have done this with computer games.
Yeah.
There'd be some video games that would deal with this sort of thing. But one, by making a co-op board game sort of thing, I mean, and it could be a co-op and a video game thing too. You could play it online, but by doing it as a tabletop in-person thing, one, you're working with your people, so you have this kind of sense of community there. And it's kind of the other thing that I think one reason why tabletop gaming has really just exploded in the last decade. We're so used to looking at screens all day and phones and stuff that it's really nice to kind of break away
I think
from that.
it's a release from our segmented lives. Suddenly you're in the group with, I mean, I use it with board games in the youth group all the time, because they're forced to work, you're interacting
Yeah.
for long periods of time as opposed to being distracted or what. I mean, obviously we do a lot of other sorts of games too, sports games.
Mm-hmm. But it's a unique experience. And anyway, I just thought that was fascinating. I mean, those are like 2 games of all the games I demoed,
But
several other
interactive
ones. But
fiction,
interactive fiction, and where the story was a lot more the focus than I'd seen before. So I think it'd be kind of cool to see that. I hope that's a trend that continues.
Yeah, awesome.
So with that, I think that will do it for us this time around. It's getting kind of dark out here.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. I don't know. There's
that pool is looking very mystical all of a sudden.
that guy. I guess he's like the maintenance guy or something. He seems kind of like furtive and worried today.
And yet he kind of reminds me of John Adams for some weird reason.
Yeah, it's very strange.
I can't put my finger on it. But anyway, we should wrap this up. Nick, where can they find all our episodes?
On the internet. They can go to derailedtrainsofthought.blogspot.com, subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, etc. Follow us on Twitter, derailed_trains.
And give us a like on Facebook if you haven't yet.
Yes.
Help spread the word of your favorite storytelling podcast.
And join us for our other podcast, Weekly Hijack, where we're going through Babylon 5, which you should be watching one way or another.
It is available on Amazon Prime.
Yes. We were like pushing that.
I know. J. Michael Straczynski should really give us a cut, like maybe a penny per episode or something.
Yeah, or I'll just take like, I don't know, I was thinking something cool, some sort of prop, a PVG or something like that.
Ooh, I want a data crystal.
Oh, I'll take a data crystal.
I want a data. I really wish they made like data crystal flash drives. That'd be the coolest thing ever.
I just wanted one of those sticks that Marcus runs around with.
Oh yes,
I'll take that.
The extendo pole.
Yeah, I'm sure they have some sort of cool Mimbari name. But.
I'm always curious how that works because it looks like a real prop.
Yeah,
but I don't know how they're doing that exactly. It's probably not as sturdy as they make it sound.
No, it's probably like one of those lightsabers that extend when you flick it.
Yeah.
Sort of thing. But anyways,
you have a soundtrack.
I have
right?
a soundtrack.
So tell us about that.
So this is Mario for Airports 1-1. I picked it because apparently this is based on kind of a postmodern piece of music called, I think, just Music for Airport.
Oh, okay. I was wondering where the airport thing came from.
And where basically like took a track and kind of just kept looping it over each other and cutting it up. And normally you have a progression, and this is sort of just, it's very ambient, very like, you take kind of the theme and you kind of play it over each other and move it around and make it dreamlike.
Okay.
And
I mean, it is kind of airy, but it's not something I would expect to hear at an airport necessarily.
No, I think the airport one they took like is in the write-up. I think they took something from an airport, like maybe sound from airport or something.
Oh, okay.
One of those sort of modernist.
Okay.
Anyways, this is remixed by Zach Action, and it's kind of relaxing, and I enjoy it.
From Super Mario World.
Super Mario World, correct.
Okay. We've had a nice string of closing soundtracks that are very like peaceful and chill, and so
it's our convention. But this has been episode 92.
92.
We're working our way up to 100.
That's right. It's the road to 100.
Which will be, who knows what will happen then.
Who knows? We never can predict what the podcast has in store for us.
That's true.
Until next time, this is Tim.
This is Nick.
Bye-bye.
Adios.